June 18, 2026. The morning air had barely settled when the sound of war drums echoed across the desert, marking the beginning of what was proclaimed as the most ambitious ground invasion in United States history. What was supposed to be a swift and overwhelming victory would soon spiral into something far darker. Right at dawn, from military bases stationed in Kuwait and Iraq, the United States officially launched its large-scale ground offensive toward Iran. From the White House, Donald Trump delivered a thunderous announcement, declaring the start of what he called Operation Persian Gate, a campaign boldly promised to dismantle Iran's sovereignty. Within days, his words carried absolute confidence, almost theatrical in tone, as if the outcome had already been decided before the first tank even crossed the border. Columns of M1A2 Abrams tanks, accompanied by Bradley fighting vehicles, rolled forward in massive formations. Behind them, hundreds of thousands of troops from the 1st Infantry Division and the 101st Airborne advanced with mechanical precision. The sheer scale of the deployment reflected a belief deeply rooted in Washington that overwhelming force alone could crush any resistance Tehran might attempt to mount. In Tel Aviv, inside a highly secured military command center, Israeli generals watched the operation unfold through satellite feeds. Cheers broke out among them as their strongest ally finally moved decisively. For them, this invasion represented more than just a military campaign. It was a long-awaited opportunity to permanently eliminate the Iranian missile threat that had loomed over the region for years. But across the border, deep within Iranian territory, a very different story was unfolding. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Zerg had no intention of stopping the invasion at the border. Instead, they deliberately allowed American forces to push several kilometers inward. It was not weakness, it was calculation. Every movement of the invading force had already been anticipated, mapped, and studied. The Zagros mountain range, with its steep ridges and hidden passages, had been transformed into a vast, mathematically designed kill zone. What Washington saw as progress was, in reality, a trap slowly tightening. As the first wave of American armored units entered the narrow mountain corridors, the environment began to betray them. The terrain was nothing like the flat deserts they had trained for. Towering cliffs, sharp turns, and concealed caves disrupted their formations and stripped away their tactical advantage. Sensors and targeting systems, designed for open-field combat, struggled to detect threats hidden high above. Meanwhile, Iranian forces intimately familiar with every inch of the landscape had positioned snipers and anti-tank missile teams along elevated ridgelines, far beyond the reach of conventional countermeasures. Then, without warning, the trap was sprung. Explosions ripped through the mountainsides as Iranian forces triggered controlled demolitions, collapsing key sections of terrain to block both entry and exit points. The American convoy was suddenly trapped inside a narrow valley, unable to maneuver, unable to retreat. What had been a confident advance turned into a desperate struggle. For survival within minutes, this was not just an ambush, it was a demonstration that knowledge of terrain could outweigh even the most advanced military technology. From above, Israeli surveillance systems began to detect the shift. On their screens, green indicators representing American units flickered, then turned red one by one. Confusion replaced confidence as it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The mountains of Zagros had become alive with hostility. Every rock, every ridge, every shadow concealed danger. The invading force was no longer advancing, it was being systematically dismantled, and as the sun climbed higher into the sky, the reality became undeniable. What began as a show of dominance was rapidly transforming into the opening chapter of a catastrophic military disaster. As the morning advanced on June 18, 2026, the situation inside the Zagros Mountains deteriorated at a terrifying pace. What had initially appeared to be a controlled advance quickly transformed into chaos as American forces found themselves trapped within a battlefield they neither fully understood nor were prepared to dominate. Roughly 30 minutes after entering the mountain corridors, the massive U.S. convoy began to lose all tactical cohesion. The narrow passes, steep cliffs, and unpredictable terrain disrupted communication lines and fractured unit coordination. Tanks that once moved in disciplined formation were now scattered, struggling to navigate terrain that seemed almost designed to break them apart, and in many ways it was. Iranian forces, operating under the URG, had already calculated every possible movement the invading army could make. As the lead American elements pushed deeper into the valleys, the Iranians executed a devastating encirclement maneuver. Explosions thundered across the ridgelines, sealing off escape routes with landslides and debris. The American column was now completely boxed and cut off from reinforcements and stripped of mobility. From elevated positions, Iranian anti-tank missile units unleashed a relentless barrage. Delavia and Alma's missiles struck with brutal precision, tearing through Abrams' tanks that had once been seen as nearly invincible. One after another, the armored giants erupted into flames, turning the narrow valleys into corridors of fire and destruction. The psychological impact was immediate. Inside command systems monitoring the battle, Israeli observers began to witness the scale of the unfolding disaster. The green indicators representing U.S. units continued to blink out, replaced by red signals marking destruction and loss. The early optimism that filled Tel Aviv's command center began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Iranian forces employed a highly effective form of vertical guerrilla warfare. Fighters emerged from hidden positions atop the mountains, launching attacks before disappearing into underground tunnel systems that made retaliation nearly impossible. Even advanced American air support, including Apache helicopters, struggled to respond effectively. By the time they arrived, the attackers had already vanished. Despite mounting casualties, orders from Washington remained unchanged. Donald Trump, determined to maintain momentum, reportedly ignored the rising number of losses and continued to push reinforcements into the same deadly corridors. His insistence on pressing forward only fed more troops into what had effectively become a massive killing zone. The imbalance between strategy and reality became impossible to ignore. The very advantage that America relied on its superior numbers became a liability in such confined terrain. With limited space to maneuver, large troop formations turned into easy targets. Every movement was anticipated, every route pre-mapped by Iranian forces who navigated the mountains with fluid precision by around 9 o'clock. In the morning, the situation reached a critical turning point. American troops on the front lines began to realize that the promised air support was no longer reliable. Iranian air defense systems, including Bava R-373 and K-Hordad-15, successfully intercepted incoming aircraft attempting to provide cover. Without aerial dominance, U.S. infantry units were left exposed to relentless artillery strikes. Soon after, Iranian rocket artillery began saturating the valleys with thermobaric warheads. The explosions were devastating not just in force but in effect. The blasts consumed oxygen within confined spaces, suffocating soldiers inside makeshift shelters without the need for direct impact. Entire groups of troops were neutralized. In seconds, unable to fight back against a weapon they could barely comprehend, panic began to spread. Surviving American soldiers found themselves hunted at close range. Iranian units, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, closed in with small arms and grenades, eliminating isolated groups with ruthless efficiency. The battlefield had shifted from mechanized warfare to brutal, close-quarters survival. Back in Tel Aviv, the atmosphere had completely changed. Reports of heavy American losses started leaking through independent communication channels, triggering alarm within Israeli military leadership. Emergency preparations began as officials feared that Iran's ground success could soon translate into broader regional escalation. What had started as a confident alliance operation was now unraveling in real time. For the American forces trapped within the Zagros Mountains, the realization was unavoidable. They were no longer the hunters, they had become the hunted. Based on the discussions in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, it can be concluded that the entire content of this text consistently focuses on the main issue introduced from the beginning. Each section plays an essential role in building a comprehensive understanding of the topic. Chapter 1 presented the background and general overview, forming the foundation of the discussion. It was then followed by Chapter 2, which explored the core material in greater depth, providing more detailed and structured explanations. Both chapters complement each other and serve as the primary basis for forming the conclusions in this section. Therefore, it can be emphasized that the overall content remains aligned with the original topic. There is no shift in meaning, only a slight adjustment in wording to make the content clearer and easier to understand without changing its core message. Suggestions. As a closing note, several suggestions can be offered for future improvement. First, the discussion could be further expanded by including more diverse references or examples. Second, the delivery of the material could be made more engaging to enhance reader comprehension. In addition, it is important to continuously evaluate and refine the content to ensure it remains relevant over time. This way, the work can provide value not only in the present but also in the future.